to Dr. Lewis. Dear Dick, about a fortnight is now elapsed since we left the capital of Scotland, directing our course towards Stirling, where we lay. The castle of this place is such another as that of Edinburgh, and affords a surprising prospect of the windings of the River Forth, which are so extraordinary that the distance from hence to Allow by land is but 40 miles, and by water it is 24. Allow is a neat thriving town that depends in a great measure on the commerce of Glasgow, the merchants of which send hither tobacco and other articles to be deposited in warehouses for exportation from the Firth of Forth. In our way hither we visited a flourishing ironwork, where, instead of burning wood, they use coal, which they have the art of clearing in such a manner as frees it from the sulphur that would otherwise render the metal too brittle for working. Excellent coal is found in almost every part of Scotland. The soil of this district produces scarce any other grain but oats, lid barley, perhaps because it is poorly cultivated, and almost altogether unenclosed. The few enclosures they have consist of paltry walls of loose stones gathered from the fields, which indeed they cover, as if they had been scattered on purpose. When I expressed my surprise that the peasants did not disencumber their grounds of these stones, a gentleman, well acquainted with the theory as well as practice of farming, assured me that the stones, far from being prejudicial, were serviceable to the crop. This philosopher had ordered a field of his own to be cleared, manured and sown with barley, and the produce was more scanty than before. He caused the stones to be replaced, and next year the crop was as good as ever. The stones were removed a second time, and the harvest failed, they were again brought back, and the ground retrieved its fertility. The same experiment has been tried in different parts of Scotland with the same success. Astonished at this information, I desired to know in what manner he accounted for this strange phenomenon, and he said there were 3 ways in which the stones might be serviceable. They might possibly restrain an excess in the perspiration of the earth, analogous to colliquative sweats, by which the human body is sometimes wasted and consumed. They might act as so many fences to protect the tender blade from the piercing winds of the spring, or, by multiplying the reflection of the sun, they might increase the warmth, so as to mitigate the natural chillness of the soil and climate. But, surely this excessive perspiration might be more effectually checked by different kinds of manure, such as ashes, lime, chalk, or marl, of which last it seems there are many pits in this kingdom. As for the warmth, it would be much more equally obtained. By enclosures, the cultivation would require less labor, and the plows, harrows, and horses would not suffer half the damage which they now sustain. These northwestern parts are by no means fertile in corn. The ground is naturally barren and moorish. The peasants are poorly lodged, meagre in their looks, mean in their apparel, and remarkably dirty. This last reproach they might easily wash off, by means of those lakes, rivers, and rivulets of pure water, with which they are so liberally supplied by nature. Agriculture cannot be expected to flourish where the farms are small, the lease is short, and the husbandman begins upon a rack rent, without a sufficient stock to answer the purposes of improvement. The granaries of Scotland are the banks of the Tweed, the counties of East and Mid Lothian, the Carse of Gowrie, in Perthshire, equal in fertility to any part of England, and some tracts in Aberdeenshire and Murray, where I am told the harvest is more early than in Northumberland, although they lie above 2 degrees farther north. I have a strong curiosity to visit many places beyond the Forth and the Tay, such as Perth, Dundee, Montrose, and Aberdeen, which are towns equally elegant and thriving, but the season is too far advanced to admit of this addition to my original plan. I am so far happy as to have seen Glasgow, which, to the best of my recollection and judgment, is one of the prettiest towns in Europe, and, without all doubt, it is one of the most flourishing in Great Britain. In short, it is a perfect beehive in point of industry. It stands partly on a gentle declivity, but the greatest part of it is in a plain, watered by the River Clyde. The streets are straight, open, airy, and well paved, and the houses lofty and well built of hewn stone. At the upper end of the town, there is a venerable cathedral that may be compared with York Minster or Westminster, and, about the middle of the descent from this to the cross, is the college, a respectable pile of building, with all manner of accommodation for the professors and students, including an elegant library, and observatory well provided with astronomical instruments. The number of inhabitants is said to amount to 30,000, and marks of opulence and independency appear in every quarter of this commercial city, which, however, is not without its inconveniences and defects. The water of their public pumps is generally hard and brackish, an imperfection the loss excusable, as the River Clyde runs by their doors, in the lower part of the town, and there are rivulets and springs above the cathedral, sufficient to fill a large reservoir with excellent water, which might be thence distributed to all the different parts of the city. It is of more consequence to consult the health of the inhabitants in this article than to employ so much attention in beautifying their town with new streets, squares, and churches. Another defect, not so easily remedied, is the shallowness of the river, which will not float vessels of any burthen within 10 or 12 miles of the city, so that the merchants are obliged to load and unload their ships at Greenock and Port Glasgow, situated about 14 miles nearer the mouth of the Frith, where it is about 2 miles broad. The people of Glasgow have a noble spirit of enterprise. Mr. Moore, a surgeon, to whom I was recommended from Edinburgh, introduced me to all the principal merchants of the place. Here I became acquainted with Mr. Cochrane, who may be styled one of the sages of this kingdom. He was first magistrate at the time of the last rebellion. I sat as member when he was examined in the House of Commons, upon which occasion Mr. P. observed he had never heard such a sensible evidence given at that bar. I was also introduced to Dr. John Gordon, a patriot of a truly Roman spirit, who is the father of the linen manufacture in this place, and was the great promoter of the city workhouse, infirmary, and other works of public utility. Had he lived in ancient Rome, he would have been honored with a statue at the public expense. I moreover conversed with one Mr. G. SSF.D., whom I take to be one of the greatest merchants in Europe. In the last war, he is said to have had at one time 25 ships with their cargoes, his own property, and to have traded for above £500,000 a year. The last war was a fortunate period for the commerce of Glasgow. The merchants, considering that their ships bound for America, launching out at once into the Atlantic by the north of Ireland, pursued a track very little frequented by privateers, resolved to insure one another, and saved a very considerable sum by this resolution, as few or none of their ships were taken. You must know I have a sort of national attachment to this part of Scotland, the great church dedicated to St. Munga, the river Clyde, and other particulars that smack of our Welsh language and customs, contribute to flatter me with the notion that these people are the descendants of the Britons who once possessed this country. Without all question, this was a Cumbrian kingdom. Its capital was Dumbarton, a corruption of Dunbritain, which still exists as a royal borough, at the influx of the Clyde and Leven, 10 miles below Glasgow. The same neighbourhood gave birth to St. Patrick, the Apostle of Ireland, at a place where there is still a church and village, which retain his name. Hard by are some vestiges of the famous Roman wall, built in the reign of Antonine, from the Clyde to the Forth, and fortified with castles, to restrain the incursions of the Scots or Caledonians, who inhabited the West Highlands. In a line parallel to this wall, the merchants of Glasgow have determined to make a navigable canal betwixt the two firths, which will be of incredible advantage to their commerce, in transporting merchandise from one side of the island to the other. From Glasgow we travelled along the Clyde, which is a delightful stream, adorned on both sides with villas, towns, and villages. Here is no one of groves, and meadows, and cornfields interspersed, but on this side of Glasgow, there is little other grain than oats and barley. The first are much better, the last much worse, than those of the same species in England. I wonder, there is so little rye, which is a grain that will thrive in almost any soil, and it is still more surprising, that the cultivation of potatoes should be so much neglected in the Highlands, where the poor people have not meal enough to supply them with bread through the winter. On the other side of the river are the towns of Paisley and Renfrew. The first, from an inconsiderable village, is become one of the most flourishing places of the kingdom, enriched by the linen, cambric, flowered lawn, and silk manufactures. It was formerly noted for a rich monastery of the monks of Clugny, who wrote the famous Scoti Chronicon, called the Black Book of Paisley. The old abbey still remains, converted into a dwelling-house, belonging to the Earl of Dundonald. Renfrew is a pretty town, on the banks of Clyde, capital of the Shire, which was heretofore the patrimony of the Stuart family, and gave the title of Baron to the King's eldest son, which is still assumed by the Prince of Wales. The Clyde we left a little on our left hand at Dunbritton, where it widens into an estuary or frith, being augmented by the influx of the Leven. On this spot stands the castle formerly called Alcluyd, washed by these two rivers on all sides, except a narrow isthmus, which at every springtide is overflowed. The whole is a great curiosity, from the quality and form of the rock, as well as from the nature of its situation. We now cross the water of Leven, which, though nothing near so considerable as the Clyde, is much more transparent, pastoral, and delightful. This charming stream is the outlet of Loch Lomond, and through a tract of 4 miles pursues its winding course, murmuring over a bed of pebbles, till it joins the Frith at Dunbritton. A very little above its source, on the lake, stands the house of Cameron, belonging to Mr. Smollett, so embosomed in an oak wood, that we did not see it till we were within 50 yards of the door. I have seen the Lago di Garda, Albano, de Vico, Bolsena, and Geneva, and, upon my honour, I prefer Loch Lomond to them all, a preference which is certainly owing to the verdant islands that seem to float upon its surface, affording the most enchanting objects of repose to the excursive view. Nor are the banks destitute of beauties, which even partake of the sublime. On this side they display a sweet variety of woodland, cornfield, and pasture, with several agreeable villas emerging as it were out of the lake, till, at some distance, the prospect terminates in huge mountains covered with heath, which being in the bloom, affords a very rich covering of purple. Everything here is romantic beyond imagination. This country is justly styled the Arcadia of Scotland, and I don't doubt but it may vie with Arcadia in everything but climate. I am sure it excels it in verdure, wood, and watered. What say you to a natural basin of pure water, near 30 miles long, and in some places 7 miles broad, and in many above 100 fathom deep, having 24 habitable islands, some of them stocked with deer, and all of them covered with wood, containing immense quantities of delicious fish, salmon, pike, trout, perch, flounders, eels, and powans, the last a delicate kind of freshwater herring peculiar to this lake, and finally communicating with the sea, by sending off the Leven, through which all those species, except the powan, make their exit and entrance occasionally? Enclosed I send you the copy of a little ode to this river, by Dr. Smollett, who was born on the banks of it, within 2 miles of the place where I am now writing. It is at least picturesque and accurately descriptive, if it has no other merit. There is an idea of truth in an agreeable landscape taken from nature, which pleases me more than the gayest fiction which the most luxuriant fancy can display. I have other remarks to make, but as my paper is full, I must reserve them till the next occasion. I shall only observe at present that I am determined to penetrate at least 40 miles into the Highlands, which now appear like a vast fantastic vision in the clouds, inviting the approach of yours always, Matt. Bramble Cameron, August 28th. Odto Leven water on Leven's banks, while free to rove, and tune the rural pipe to love, I envied not the happiest swain that ever trod Arcadian plain. Pure stream, in whose transparent wave my youthful limbs I want to lave, no torrents stain thy limpid source, no rocks impede thy dimpling course, that sweetly warbles o'er its bed, with white, round, polished pebbles spread, while, lightly poised, the scaly brood in myriads cleave thy crystal flood, the springing trout in speckled pride, the salmon, monarch of the tide, the ruthless pike, intent on war, the silver eel, and mottled PR** devolving from thy parent lake, a charming maze thy waters make, by boweress of birch, and groves of pine, and hedges flowardy with eglantine. Still on thy banks so gaily green, may numberous herds and flocks be seen, and lasses chanting o'er the pale, and shepherds piping in the dale, an ancient faith that knows no guile, and industry embrowned with toil, and hearts resolved, and hands prepared, the blessings they enjoy to guard. The parr is a small fish, not unlike the smelt, which it rivals in delicacy and flavor.